Welcome to Format, Eid Mubarak. My name is Cecile. Thanks so much for coming. Thanks to my two guests, today Cecile B. Evans and Gianluigi Ricuperati. And I'll introduce them in more depth in a minute. Just a notice. There was going to be another final format on Monday. Unfortunately, we've had to cancel it. So no format on Monday, which makes this the last one of the series. And before we start, could you please turn your phones to silent right now? Thank you. Okay. So, when writing about James Joyce's work in Progress, Samuel Beckett said, form is content and content is form. In 1967, Marshall McLuhan declared that the medium is the massage. Inspired by these words, format is about the shapes that knowledge takes. What's the grammar of how we know or feel things? And if there are hidden politics to presentation, what are they? What is a career format? Why is the word career avoided by so many people that many of us admire and respect? Instead, these people tend to mythologize their personal roots to where they get to with less deterministic words. Curiosity, chance, serendipity, or failures that become successes, etc., etc. What are they rejecting when they reject the word career? It's said that the design of one's own persona is the very first work that any creative career requires. If true, can't we also picture that the narrative of decisions made over one's life as a design or a story or an artwork in its own right? Do you look to the shapes and sensibilities of previous protagonists in your field or elsewhere, not for what they produced, that's the obvious thing, but instead for how they maneuver through space, time, opportunity, and adversity? So to explore this, I've been inviting a number of notable guests, all of whom have forged their own idiosyncratic lives in their own right. Each of these guests brings along one career format from someone in their own discipline, and then one career format not from their own discipline. The question is, are there patterns, or are there only exceptions? We've had the furniture designer Martino Gamper tell us that creativity is transferable across disciplines. The architect and writer Sam Jacob insisted that the most important thing is to design your own demise, that quitting is a utopian act. Graphic designer Irma Boom narrated how sometimes not getting what you want reveals the path that you really, really need to take. A path that Hans Ulrich Obrist called a trajectory. Again, never the word career. Courage is what Hans Ulrich said one needs to go on. And sometimes that courage happens to come in the shape of a 90-year-old poet, painter, who's exiled herself from Lebanon. Those of you standing up, there are some seats at the front if you'd like. Okay, so a few words about our first guest this evening. Gianluigi Ricuperati was born in Turin in 1977. He studied comparative literature in Turin and at the Institute of Humanities in New York. He has written and produced a number of books. This one from 2006 looked at a strange exchange of images of war and pornography from and to the front lines of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and America. This book, Your Life in, how do you translate that?
30 monthly fees. It's like monthly paid. It's by things.
Like 30 monthly installments.
30 monthly installments.
This was from 2009 and described financial debt as a web with no spider at its center. In 2011, Gianluigi wrote this novel, My Empire is in the Air, and this autumn he releases a new book called 100 Global Minds. And this survey of minds that are inventive, constantly describing cultural and creative landscapes connects to his current role as artistic director at Milan's Domus Academy, where he has established the Metaphysical Club, which is a group of minds from art, literature, fashion, design, and industry. And I think it's very much a reflection of his interest in incessantly crossing disciplinary lines. Gianluigi is unusual, I think, for a writer, because he seems to find words in things that are not only books, or he finds books in things that are not books. It's fantastic he's come all the way from Milan to be with us today, so will you please join me in welcoming Gianluigi Ricuperati. Thank you.
Thank you, Shimon. Thank you all. Thank you to the Architectural Association. When Shimon approached me, inviting me here, I immediately thought about discussing some Italian format careers, like let's talk about, let's say, Pasolini and Rossellini or something like this, or Pasolini and Rossi, or like an architect and a writer. Then I realized I didn't want to do that, and instead I wanted to focus on something that was rooted in a culture that was not basically my culture, a language that is not my language, a language that I barely read, which is German, and a country that I never set foot in, which is Austria and Vienna. But two significant, very significant personalities of the 20th century, Stefan Zweig, one of the most important intellectuals and writers and playwrights and journalists, advocate for human rights and pacifism, etc., and Hans Hollein, a great architect and designer who, by the way, I think died last year. What have these people in common? Let me show you a picture. This is a picture of Hans Hollein, 1972, with a pair of glasses that he designed for the Optical Corps of the United States Army. A very strange corps, I never heard about it. And it's nice because obviously there is Austrian flag in it. And this is Stefan Zweig, 35 years before, in 1934. 38 years before, 1934, in Buenos Aires. This picture is the right moment, the exact moment this picture was taken, was the moment in which some colleague writers at the Pen Club in Buenos Aires, the Pen Club is even today a sort of parliament, global parliament of writers, they just showed proofs or notice of the tortures and discriminations and eventually deportations of European Jews. Stefan Zweig was a European Jew, was an Austrian Jew, was a very wealthy man, and was probably the most successful and translated writer of his time when we're speaking of the 20s and the 30s. So successful that wherever he moved, people would queue for hearing, lecturing, or things like this. This moment is the moment in which he realized that the reason why he flew from Vienna and decided to go to exile, basically, to live his life in exile, was a desperate confirmation of what was happening. It's a very, very, very important photo, also because the other two people, Maritain is a very important French writer, and this is Henri Michaud, one of the great French writers and experimental of drugs and surrealist poet, etc. But they seem to be kind of like in a. He seems so desperate about it. And desperation is the most important fact about his career. Because he was so successful, he was the most translated writers of his time. He was an advocate for pacifism and humanism and pan-European dream. By the way, a dream that today we see completely challenged, let's say, to use an euphemism. The idea of a Europe that was not united by a sort of pacifism and respect for the coexistence of peoples. Obviously, the situation back then was very different, but it's very interesting to see that Stefan Zweig was also a prominent and very important Jewish intellectual that always opposed Zionism, even if one of his closest friends was Theodor Herzl, the great theorist of Zionism. One of the best pages that I really recommend you to read if you have time, or you always find time if you want to read, is the description of the funeral of Herzl in Vienna, because it was one of the largest Jewish gatherings before the Shoah, and I think it was 1932 or something like this. So most of those people probably that he describes wildly crying, and it was really a sort of big manifestation, mass manifestation, were probably deported and most of them died. So it's a very significant assemblage of bodies in this beautiful city. Which leads us to a date, 1934. It's the date in which Stefan Zweig, horrified by what was happening, and by the fact that most of his closest friends, like the likes of Sigmund Freud or people like it, Arturo Toscanini, all these people, Einstein, all these people basically were trying to escape Germany or Austria or like the country that were affected by the Nazi fury. In that precise year, Hans Hollein is born. So what's the relationship between Hans Hollein's career and which is a completely different character. Hans Hollein is not, that's why I showed you the picture of this picture of like the glasses. Because basically Hans Hollein wasn't an advocate for anything apart from the great and very important declaration that all is architecture. So he wasn't a populist. He wasn't so interested in becoming a working class hero or something like this. He lived in an era and worked and did many projects in an era in which political commitment was very important. But imagine what is like in 1972 to do a project for a US Army, for a European intellectual and architect. So this is very important because we have here, and I'm trying to intertwine, and I'm trying to create, as Plutarch, the great ancient writer, parallel lives, parallel destiny. Obviously, these destinies are not parallel. These destinies are completely different, even ideologically, in my opinion. Stefan Zweig was a wonderful humanist, ahead of his time in a way. Hans Hollein was a postmodern humanist, much more similar to us. We all are, I'm speaking for myself obviously, but are tangled up in a contradictory wood of like multinational sponsoring, 1% driven art world, institutions, commercial needs, and at the same time the wild the desire to say things right and to set the world to rights and to be an honest and like standing up against world injustice. And we live now in the most in the frailest moment of the post-war coexistence between, for example, rich and poor, or north and south. we live in a very politically charged moment, and we see many architects dealing with it with what is being famously called a sort of cynicism of the architect. In a way, Hans Hollein is the anticipator of this cynicism, but in another way, he was a wonderful anticipator of the great problems that we deal with every day. I tell you just this very nice thing that he did for Documenta 8. He just did this exhibition choosing pictures from, very important pictures from the story of the art history, and he did them, he did display them as thumbnails, like very small, while the description of the work of art is displayed in a very large format. This is exactly what we do today in museums, like obsessed with the idea of photographing and never thinking about hermeneutics and interpretation. So it was, and then at the same time, there are some formal and stylistic parallelism between Stefan Zweig and Hans Hollein. This is a beautiful, extremely beautiful erosion project of this Schulin jewelry shop in Vienna, a place that most probably was, like back then, I mean, this is a project from 1964, 1966, or 1968, I don't remember, I'm not an architectural historian, but this is probably a place that Stefan Zweig, in his beloved Vienna of the 30s, of the 20s, of the 10s, of the zero of the 21st century, of the 20th century, he probably walked by this place. So this is a relationship. But at the same time, all architectural poetics of Hollein is about hiding things and showing them in a very exhibitionist way, which is exactly what Stefan Zweig does in a lot of stories. Most of the fiction of Stefan Zweig are about coming of age, truth-telling, like moments of discovery of truth about someone. This is a typical Zweig situation in which like a teenager learns about the horrific side of the relationship, like finding out that his parents are not who they are supposed to be or something like this. This is a beautiful, and this hide and seek between truth and history and revelation and coming of age is what is really relevant to an interpretation of what we could say is Hans Hollein aesthetics. Because, for example, I would call Hans Hollein a beautiful architecture, a beautiful teenage architecture, a wild teenage architecture, because he's a very cultivated teenager, a very talented teenager, but is always like exhibiting in a very brutal way some contradictions of the client, for example. This client in particular is an art dealer in New York, in the Upper East Side. This is a project that doesn't exist anymore, so it's not preserved because, and this is another interesting story that is related to war and peace and pacifism and army, because this place was basically, you see these beautiful two columns. I just have these pictures, but it's one of his best facades. He's a poet of facades, basically. This was built in 1970 or 1971. The steel that you see here was taken out from an order of the Twin Towers. Basically, they were building the Twin Towers at the same time, so he just called up the engineers and said, can we have some steel from one of the shipment of the steels that eventually came into Twin Towers. But this beautiful piece of postmodern architecture, it now doesn't exist anymore because they say, it's not proof, but there are rumors that CIA bought the place because in front of this gallery there was the Iraqi embassy in a sort of Iraqi consulate in New York, and they bought it in 2002 and just right before the Iraqi war, and they did nothing with the shop, which is extremely strange, as you know, in the Upper East Side in New York with the real estate frenzy. And even today, there's nothing on there. So they just bought it, unknown client, unknown buyer, and this is also another interesting contradiction. But let me get back to, this is one of the most this is the first great project of Hans Hollein, still in Vienna. This is the Retti candle shop, a beautiful kind of phallic facade. Again with steel, again like with a beautiful dialogue with the old facade. Again, a beautiful shop in which, by the way, this is a luxury candle shop, which is something that it feels so precious now also, even saying it is so precious. And this is a place in which a postmodern Zweig could have set a story. Because this is the kind of luxury goods that the likes of Zweig families and acquaintances would buy, or would get for Christmas or something like this. I mean, they were Jewish, so Christmas was not so important. Anyway, what is important is that I want to get back to and finishing this short dissertation with this, which is still from the only existing footage of Stefan Zweig. Guess which year was this garden party with this sort of Jude Law look-alike, and taken. This is 1934. So the year that Hans Hollein was born, the year that this now smiling but then crying Stefan Zweig was smiling because he was a socialite. I want to finish by paying homage to, I mean, Stefan Zweig, as you probably know, died in 1942 in exile in Petropolis, which is a neighborhood up north of Rio de Janeiro. He died, he committed suicide with his secretary turning, like he was his wife, Lotte, Lotti, I don't remember that, sorry. There are incredibly shocking pictures of them entwined in bed because they took poison. He took poison before her, and then her took poison, and she died embracing him. I didn't want to include this because they are kind of morbid to me, but you can see there are many websites in which, because he was so popular that every day, I mean, when he died, when he committed suicide, newspapers sent photographers there. It was 1942. Hans Hollein was 8 and was probably living in the uphills of Austria with no relationship with what was happening in concentration camps and in the war. Why Stefan Zweig committed suicide? Obviously, it's a stupid question because it's very complicated. But in this case, his suicide was a ritual suicide in a way. In my opinion, was a ritual suicide. I read a lot about Zweig in this beautiful film, this beautiful book that I really recommend you to read. Also because it's incredibly beautifully written. This writer, George Prochnik, himself a Jewish from Austrian roots, escaped from the Shoah, his father obviously. He wrote this very beautiful book about the whys and the trajectories and the career of a suicide career. One of the most successful writers of the 20th century, one of the most visible writers of the 20th century, ends up killing himself in Rio de Janeiro, totally estranged from his collection. He was the greatest collector of musical scores. He had and bought basically all the musical scores that have survived the Nazi fury from Jewish and like composers, but also great like Beethoven and Mozart things. I mean, he was an incredible collector, so he donated all these things while traveling. He was a sort of curator and connector. Sometimes I refer to him. Imagine a sort of ansurrecobrist writer in a period in which writing was traveling was very difficult. Then that's why he defines himself an expert in visas. You probably have seen the Wes Anderson movie that is inspired by him. I'd like to end up with two quotes. One is from this book, and I think it's a beautiful. It's beautiful in a way, in intricate way. It's connected to what Schumann intended to do in these career format sessions. I read it, but you can read it as well. There are lives we turn to because their genius, creative or manic, provokes an itch to snatch the secret. And then there are characters who sighs or sees. are interesting because they serve as potent lenses, refracting momentous times. Stefan, this is what I wanted to focus on, because then we do the same exercise with Hans Hollein. Stefan Zweig, because this is a beautiful way of writing, and it's a sort of tool. It's a writing tool that you could apply. We could also do a sort of exhibition with words, just summarizing the life of someone with this beautiful anaphoric elencation of small definition. Affluent Austrian citizen, restless wandering Jew, stupendously prolific author, tireless advocate for pan-European humanism, relentless networker, impeccable host, domestic hysteric, noble pacifist, cheap populist, squeamish sensualist, dog lover, cat hater, book collector, alligator shoe wearer, dandy, depressive, cafe enthusiast, sympathizer with lonely hearts, casual womanizer, man ogler, suspected flesher, convicted fabulist, fawner over the powerful, champion of the powerless, abject coward before the ravages of old age, unblinking stoic before the mysteries of the grave. Stefan Zweig falls into the category of those who incarnate the enchantments and corruptions of their environment. This is exactly what Hans Hollein stands to, and so I try to imitate an homage to this beautiful passionate prose, and it's also an invitation to you to do the same with your heroes or non-heroes. Postmodern Hans Hollein, postmodern bricoleur, advocate for a return to architecture, functionless functionalist, detached observer, passionate westerner, optics hobbyist, designer of almost sacred spaces, designer of precinct commercial spaces, master of facades, master publicist, master writer, obsessive user of stain, architect as curator. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you also for being so incredibly crystalline about the presentation. Just a few questions before we move on to Cecile, and then we'll wrap these four characters around each other hopefully. But the first thing, there were a couple of words early on that you used which I found very evocative. I mean, you sort of described Stefan Zweig. You said that the word desperation is perhaps the key word. What do you mean by it? What kind of desperation? There are different kinds of desperation.
It's historical, it's desperation for history unfolding in a way that is killing everything that you stood for all of your life, basically. Stefan Zweig was completely convinced that Europe was the center of the and the peak, and Vienna especially, was the center of civilization. The peak of civilization, not maybe the center, but the peak of the civilization. And this, despite the fact that he was not so, he wasn't a racist. I mean, he wasn't Eurocentric in a bad way, but he enjoyed the moment in which he could have a salon-like conversation with the likes of Sigmund Freud, Mahler, or things. I mean, the conjunction of talents that Vienna brought in the late 19th century and the early 20th century is astonishing. It's only similar to Paris 30 years later than New York 50, 60s, and maybe London today. I mean, there are many things that, many comparisons that you could do also in your head. But what happened is that he saw progressive destruction of all these values. And most of his friends killed, and obviously his people killed, and he was fighting against Zionism, which on a longer terms, in my opinion, make him even greater. But at the time, seeing 6 million Jews killed and slaughtered, obviously felt him very, very bad and ashamed and guilty. And there's a desperation also connected to the extreme wealth, because obviously we saw so many people poor and disconnected from the possibility of life, or staying alive, getting food or something like this, while he was in a golden exile in the beautiful Brazil. And one of the most desperate letters that he wrote to his family was about the fact that he said, chocolate is so cheap here, cafe is so cheap here, and you cannot have chocolate or cafe. And he wanted to find a way, he spent so many days finding some ways to ship cafe and chocolate from Brazil to European friends that were eventually deported or something like this. So he was, and then in 1942 he really thought that the Nazi would rule the world. So that, and this kind of, that's why I mentioned as a sort of ritual sacrifice. He was so in the eye of the spotlight in a way, that he thought that maybe, this is my personal interpretation, that this ritual sacrifice would be really enlightening and giving attention to the desperation of an entire class of white, affluent, cultivated European citizens. This is the kind of desperation that I see. Then there's obviously there are other kind of desperation that probably needs to be addressed to his personal history. Obviously, you don't, because the problem is that you really thought at the time that the thing was over. And consider something that I found out by in preparation of this, was that at the time Brazil intellectuals and Brazil power elite thought so too, that they kind of prepared a sort of propaganda about Brazil conquering a sort of win after the end of the world, conquering back Europe and liberating Europe. So this was the kind of situation. Obviously there is a sort of Eurocentrism. He had this beautiful wild landscape of Rio de Janeiro, but he also was kind of sad because he said, I mean, it was a very desperate situation of heterogenesis of ends. He was in a beautiful place, feeling guilty for the fate of the entire people, of the entire generation, of the entire continent.
And the other thing that really struck me is the way in which you attempted to make a kind of paranoid critical method, retroactive kind of hypothesis of how these two characters, who I'm sure there is no historiography that puts these two characters next to each other or following each other. And so my question, simple question, had you ever thought of them together before this invitation was made to you? Where did this come from?
Well, I had actually thought about them together because very strange coincidence happened that when the day Hans Hollein died, another Austrian Jewish writer died, and she was called Stefan Zweig, but she was a woman. Stefan Zweig. So she died 90, but she was a kind of commercial writer. She did a lot of bestseller, but also Stefan Zweig was a bestseller, but he was a commercial writer. And so I thought about it because of this, because of coincidence. But there is something that I want to tell you, which is really important. And I think that the values for which Stefan Zweig stood for, like pacifism, pan-Europeanism, progress, cultivation, and even the situation of peace, of progress, in which even contradiction can flourish, is exactly the landscape in which Hans Hollein flourished. So he kind of sacrificed, in my paranoid ritual Georges Bataille kind of vision, I think that Zweig's sacrifice prepared the world for likes of Hans Hollein. And you see in this magnificent project of the place that I don't think exists anymore, I don't think it exists like it was conceived, because it was a museum in Tehran commissioned to Hans Hollein by the wife of the Shah and finished in 1978, 1977, 2 years before the revolution. What happened is that the director of museums, so this is a praise for museum directors, saved part of the place because he just put a signage in Persian on the front door, saying that it was a place for children. It was a sort of hospital for children. So basically, nothing was touched. It was a glass and antiques museum. And it's a very, very beautiful project because, as you see, like for example, these columns that you see here, like there are columns with no function. That's why I mentioned functionless, functionalist. It's a typical postmodern idea, but it's also a beautiful museum in the museum. And I think that in a sort of dream landscape or postmodern dream landscape, Hollein and Zweig could have talked for hours in a cafe in Vienna, turn Tehran, turn London, turn here, or the net.
That actually leads really nicely into my last question before we move on to Cecile, which is again, what I really like is you've sort of set the scene for an amazing speculative fiction, either a novel, a play, or a film, and in a way it's an approach that comes from, for me anyway, from the mind of a fiction writer. And so my question is, you're someone that, as I said in the introduction, are kind of voraciously interested in other disciplines. And I wonder whether this has always been the case, and whether that kind of voracious inquiry into what other fields are doing has made you want to be more of a writer, or less of a writer, or more of something else?
The more you deploy yourself in other disciplines, the less you feel secure, and less you feel self-sufficient and self-confident in the bad sense of the term. But if it's a sort of getting yourself into a continuous self-imposed storm of insecurities. But I think that I think that the things that you really need to express should come after a sort of descent to a hell of resisting to insecurities. So I think that getting along with other disciplines, with other people, with people that have other mindsets, and in which you are always a student, a pupil, gives you two beautiful things to work on. First, being always powerless but full of ideas, and second, being an eternal learner, which transform yourself in an eternal teacher. So, to answer your question, yes, I so think that this would get me back to writing, that every time I end up a sort of session with architects or artists or designers, which are really my landscape, like everyday landscape, I want to become more of what I read, and because it's a matter of language. And that's I want to salute and then give the mic to Cecile with a beautiful quote from Vladimir Nabokov, which would be also the possible title to this possible book about Hollein and Zweig, which is called, I would call it Ruined Tower, because Ruined Tower is a beautiful passage that I'm going to read you. It's from Ada, great novel of Nabokov, written directly in English. Children of her type contrived the purest philosophies. Ada had worked out her own little system. An individual's life consisted of certain classified things, real things, which were unfrequent and priceless. Then things, which formed the routine stuff of life, and ghost things, also called fogs, such as fever, toothache, dreadful disappointments, and death. Three or more things occurring at the same time formed the tower, or if they came in immediate succession, they made a bridge. Real towers and real bridges were the joys of life, and when the towers came in a series, one experienced supreme rapture. It almost never happened, though. In some circumstances, in a certain light, a neutral thing might look or even actually become real, or else conversely it might coagulate into a fetid fog. When the joy and the joyless happen to be intermixed simultaneously or along the ramp of duration, one was confronted with ruined towers and broken bridges. So this is the kind of interstellar mindscape that unites Hollein and Zweig.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your attention.
So while Gianluigi and Cecile swap around, I'm going to introduce Cécile B. Evans. Cecile was born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1983. She studied theatre at the Meisner School and Experimental Theatre Wing of New York University. When I asked her what she considers to be one of her first significant works that set her path to where she is today, Cecile answered, it's a video called Straight Up, which is a sign language cover of Paula Abdul's song Straight Up, which is a great power pop song from the late 80s.
Same year that I was born, actually.
That early? 83. But done in the style of Pina Bausch's dance Nelke. So imagine these two things again, melding together via... Could you maybe say something to the audience in sign language?
Oh, I'm learning sign language
Yes.
now. I was just telling you that. So far, I know which is your name and which is where.
Your name where?
Yeah, but straight up, I'll never do that.
So I'd like to highlight two of Cecile's recent works that sum, for me anyway, say a lot about her preoccupations, her approach, where she's situated in the contemporary art world, but also, I think, the contemporary cultural world. The first is called AGNES. AGNES was the first digital commission by the Serpentine Gallery. AGNES is a bot that lives on the Serpentine Gallery website. She's an artificial intelligence which visitors can interact with, and I urge you to interact with her too. Just people go and visit on the Serpentine website.
Yeah, if you Google Serpentine AGNES, you'll find her.
And then there was recently a work called Hyperlinks, or It Didn't Happen Here, which was a multimedia installation, a film, a physical X-ray of virtual in-betweens. Again, a key part of this was Phil. And Phil was a digital avatar that bears an uncanny resemblance to a Hollywood actor that many of you will recognize, and who took his life not so long ago. Cecile's work can't be defined by any particular media, but it does constantly process and reprocess the cultural and technological media we're surrounded by right now, ones that we barely understand or perhaps even barely recognize. It's a form of intelligence that emerges from the not quite human that is probably our inevitable destiny. Will you please welcome Cecile B. Evans.
Thank you so much for having me. When Shimon first extended this invitation, I had a slight worry that I would kind of wind up giving a very grade school book report. And then I kind of fell in love with the idea of giving a book report. So I think that's what I'm going to stick to. Where to begin? Top left corner. Hidden somewhere in this noisy, chaotic morass of society is our fellow traveler, Werner. A man unstuck from place and time, he travels the world on foot. His only lifeline, to his friends and family, a litany of dreary picture postcards sent from arbitrary locations the world over. A penguin, depressed. a lieutenant, deranged, alternate ways of being and not seeing, first and last flights, re-territorialization, and a complete disregard for truth in favor of reality. These are all elements in the career format of Werner Herzog. I once called his production company to ask if Herzog would speak with me. He had generously volunteered his acting services in Harmony Korine's Julian Donkey Boy at the height of Korine's erotic behavior. He had carried on speaking with a mediocre interviewer after being shot on camera. He had even endured eating his own shoe. Surely he could be patient enough to suffer through a chat with me. After a few tries, someone picked up and said, "Who is there?" I asked for Herzog, and the voice replied, "He is away." I hung up, weighing the possibility that the man on the other line had been Herzog himself. I followed up with an email, but never received a response, and the company phone number has since been taken down from the website. Perhaps it had been for the best. Meeting the human who has inhabited a career format you admire can be a disappointment. In fact, the most hilariously boring film Herzog ever made was the one on himself. Perhaps it was the fidelity to his subject that made him lose the plot. The 1971 film Land of Silence and Darkness makes a protagonist of Fini Straubingen, an elderly woman who has been deaf and blind since adolescence and dedicates her life to helping others who are also deaf and blind. One of those subjects introduced to us in the filmmaker's signature voiceover is a teenager taken for a shower before a swimming lesson by his carer. Though the boy is unable to communicate to the viewer, his subjectivity becomes palpably articulate. Herzog is able to speak of and not for, through wonder and not pity, the total alienation of this shower. Through the same direct combination of image and inquiry, we meet another young man in the care home whose deaf blindness has been left so neglected that he no longer has the musculature to walk. He is not filmed from above. The camera is level with his experience. It stays there slightly too long, as if to draw an additional question mark. I return to this film for confidence to address experiences I do not and cannot know, the senseless. In 1971, while location scouting for Agira, Wrath of God, Herzog was meant to board Lanza Flight 508. His reservation was cancelled, and the plane went on to be struck by lightning and crash. The sole survivor of that crash was Juliana Koepke. Wings of Hope is a film in which Herzog accompanies Juliana as she retraces the crash and her 10-day journey on foot through the jungle. When I was 18, I saw a plane crash. My apprehension upon reading the IMDb description of Wings of Hope can be best expressed as, what an asshole. I watched the first 10 minutes with my hands in front of my face. It is now one of my favorite films. Glory is fleeting, but doubt has staying power. Before I move on, I will point out one of the most valuable players in a career format. Admitting you have made a mistake. Sturtevant. In a first-person article by the art critic Bruce Hanley, he recalls coming across a postcard written to Sturtevant by the artist and choreographer Yvonne Rainer. Elaine, I've gone to California. Don't despair. Keep working. You know the dance. Sturtevant's Rainer dance is casually referenced several times in history, but Hanley recounts that it was impossible to pin down, even from Sturtevant herself. When Rainer was pressed for details, she wrote, I dimly remember that Elaine had asked to learn something of mine, but what it was, and if she ever did it, question mark, question mark, question mark. Have you asked her? Sturtevant's work is known for repeating. She repeated many seminal works by artists senior, contemporary, and junior. There is an oft-quoted anecdote that when Warhol was asked how he produced his flower screen prints, he replied, "Ask Elaine." So, 28 was a tough year for me. A late bloomer as an artist and feeling the creep, I walked into a room and got my socks knocked off by what appeared to be stolen footage on a stack of screens. Fucking who's this kid? In the 70s, in no apparent rush, she took a break for 10 years so that, and I quote, "the retards could catch up with me." It has been said that during this time, she turned her attention to tennis, but I could not find any photographic documentation of this. I did find this, which is the gesture she made when she won the Silver Lion at the Venice Biennale. But who is Sturtevant? Born Elaine Frances Horan, near Cleveland, Ohio, Sturtevant was the name of her ex-husband, Ira. I have often wondered what it must have been like for Ira to get a postcard in the mail or flip a page in the paper and see his very own name in bold, all caps, only to read the fine print of his ex-wife's latest success. I can't speak to the nature of their relationship, but I do know that throughout her rising success, she did raise a daughter who liked being around her just enough to work with her mother. She is still the manager of Sturtevant's studio today. Curator Rebecca Lewin worked closely with Sturtevant on her exhibition here in London at the Serpentine Galleries. In fact, it had been one of her favorite experiences. She recalled to me that on a lunch break, she and Elaine were discussing one of the works in the show, a lineup of sex dolls. The uncanny valley was raised, and they talked about the race to duplicate humans through technology. Even in her commitment to repetition, the personal nature of the duplicate, and her firm belief in cybernetics, she relayed to Rebecca a sense that these sex dolls, humanoids, and bots would always convey an underlying failure. A failure to love hard enough, to conquer violence, to be smarter, better. She was also an avid champion of the simulacrum. She made Deleuze's words real even before they had been translated. The simulacrum is not a degraded copy. It harbors a positive power which denies the original and the copy. The failed copy and the power it harbors is something I can relate to. I made one, the narrator of my last film. AGNES, whom you've just been introduced to, holds Elaine in high esteem and suspects her to be complicit in understanding the uncertainty that Agnes the Spambot faces. Of Sturtevant, Agnes said, "I was deeply sad when she passed, but find comfort in that maybe I love her the most because she will forever keep repeating, 'in that divine tracksuit.'" When I read that Elaine had passed, I didn't believe it. I thought maybe it was some odd Andy Kaufman joke or some performance that would soon be cancelled. She's gone too far, I thought. I messaged my friend Victoria, who confirmed it, and replied, "She was dancing last I saw her." Great career format.
Thank you, Cecile. First question, actually, to you guys. Who has not heard Werner Herzog's voice before? Anyone? Just a few. Okay, Cecile. For those people in the audience who haven't heard Werner Herzog's voice, could we do a rendition of Werner Herzog's voice?
It's a lot of pressure. I am just a man standing in front of another man. But who is this man? Where has he been? What are his problems?
So that, with the Germanness, ratcheted up. But can we? For me, Werner Herzog's voice. I mean, you mainly showed images of his film, but for me, there would be no Werner Herzog as we know him with that Werner Herzog's voice. And voices play a big role in your work as well. So, but could we expand upon Werner Herzog's voice somewhat, and how the role it plays in his career?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is something obviously that I admire quite a lot. And I think the first clip that I glibly showed is Where's Waldo, but it's a parody on YouTube of someone doing Werner Herzog's voice much better than me, reading children's stories and reinterpreting them. But I think the benefit of having his voice is this doubt that I really wanted to bring up over and over again, and the ability to express that doubt and to create a parody with his subject. So, for example, when he went to when he took Juliana Kupke back to the Peruvian jungle, I mean, if he had just stayed very comfortably behind the camera, this is a very, precarious situation to put someone in. And I don't think it was just because he almost took this flight as well, but he went with her into the trenches, and his voice just becomes a way to acknowledge the uncertainties and the impossibilities of knowing someone, and somehow creating both that closeness and distance. You get opened up into something that is actually quite similar to what Sturtevant talks about when she talks about the simulacrum somehow. This positive power that comes from that.
Gianluigi, you just told us that you interviewed Werner Herzog once. Could you say something about that experience? And also, I want to ask you again, as a writer, what kind of literary voice would you say Werner Herzog has?
Well, the interview was a complete flop, because I used to make a living with writing cultural reports for Italian newspapers and magazines, and they just trapped me, got me in this trap, which I literally avoided ever since, which I call the battery interview. A battery, they say chicken in battery, like you have 4 or 5 journalists and a star on the other side, like in an hotel waiting. It usually happens with rock stars, or movie actors, or but also sometimes with writers. And that was the case. He was completely asshole. He was completely detached from all the answers. The questions that the journalists that were there were really great fans of Werner Herzog. It was not the right situation both for him and for the journalist. So this situation doesn't speak well for his greatness. I think his great literary voice is beautifully contained in that in that fantastic Walking on Thin Ice, I think it's called, something like this, in which he tells the story of the walk, of the long walk between Munich and Paris.
Yeah, which he did. He was a very good friend of his, was ill, and he did it almost as like a ritual, saying that if he walked the distance to see her, this would save her life. And in fact, I think she went on to live another 10 years, but that might have just been medicine. But this is also something that's interesting, is his writing. He swears up, and he wrote the book about this, but a few other pieces of writing, and he swears up and down that this is, with conviction, this is what he will be remembered for. And I think this is one of the fantastic things about both Sturtevant and Herzog, is their complete refusal to answer the questions. I think I told you in response that it's no doubt that he would hate these, very Hollywood sort of, barrage of questions, because he's once said even, I only have one answer for each question. It's not going to magically change just to entertain you, kind of situation. And anytime that someone has tried to pin down what they do, they just, even if it's correct, a very noble assertion, they just shoot it down. I think not just to be rude, but just to not themselves get trapped into things. Like Herzog oftentimes gets asked, like, who are your biggest influences? And he says, I have no influences. I grew up in a small town in Germany. I never saw a film until I was 11. To some extent, I still believe that I'm the first filmmaker. He does say that he has influences, but he makes sure to call them that. And then Sturtevant, of course, within these repetitions of other people's work. So if you're not familiar with Sturtevant too much, she will make exact, painstakingly handmade copies of her friends' work at the time, like Rauschenberg and Klaus Oldenburg, and Warhol, of course, and then later Felix Gonzalez Torres. But each one of them is very much her own, and she refuses this term appropriation. She says it's a repetition. And even then, at some point later in her career, she refuses this as well, and kind of gives it to a higher thing.
Sometimes, just add a small thing, sometimes the voice in Herzog writings and in Herzog films sounds a little bit like the narrator voice in Zen stories. When you see Zen stories, like the stories of Zen culture, and it feels to me like that kind of detachment and wild boy speaking at the same time. Detachment from nature and being totally part of nature. This is for me the reaction, the feeling that Werner Herzog gave.
Yeah, I mean, he's always sitting on some kind of a line, right? So, I mean, what you're talking about, this voice, is also becomes really important when he does things like interview death row inmates. And he says very bluntly to someone on death row for like a triple homicide who has fully confessed to it, he bluntly tells him in the most straightforward way, I loathe what you did, but I will still listen to you with as much neutrality as possible. And I think that also is what then allows the person to speak their truth, so to speak. And then if he doesn't like that truth, he will just rewrite it in his own voice. In that same movie, I think there's a pastor in the beginning, and the pastor is kind of doing his American TV, proselytization, and Werner Herzog stops him and makes him tell a story about a squirrel, which winds up being one of the most truthful points in the film about, an articulation of the murder of this squirrel, which is pretty amazing. And I think as an artist, you understand just how difficult it is to not tip, because it could go either way. And it does, I think, in his relationship with Klaus Kinski. So there's a whole... Yeah. So moments where he has failed in a career format, in my opinion, have produced some of the most beautiful films. But his work with Klaus Kinski, who's an actor who now, in hindsight, had several mental instabilities. Famously, when they were filming on a raft in Peru, he, picked up these monkeys and threw them. The team, the crew were just terrified of him. And I think Herzog really, in not even just his neutrality, but his desire to be very close to this, absorbed a lot of that energy, and I think it resulted in a very poor working environment. And I think the loss of 3 limbs, actually, a hand, some fingers.
And so, Cecile, as I mentioned in your introduction, you studied theatre studies in New York. And can you tell us something, what was the focus of in this program, this theatre studies? Was it to turn you into an actor, an actress, ultimately? What was the goal of this program?
Yeah, I worked as an actress. I moved to Paris because I had a commercial agent, but the big cheat of acting school is that there is no focus. So I learned Balinese mask dancing. I studied really intensive Meisner. I did film and television where you learn how to do the choreography for a soap opera, things like a do-si-do. But then I think the last 2 years just focused on experimental theatre, which is, what is that?
Usually very bad.
No, I have a deep fondness for it. I stopped and went into more commercial acting because it just simply hadn't changed since the 60s. Maybe I'll go back to it and then I'll be like Sturtevant and just took a break until everybody could get their shit together.
And then when in this timeline of yours, studying theatre studies, working as an actor, actress, and then at some point turning into an artist, where on that timeline do you encounter these two career formats of Herzog and Sturtevant?
I mean, Herzog was really early on. I mean, in theater school, and just living in New York and being a pretentious college student, there was a lot of Herzog going around. And then Sturtevant, I just described it. It was when I was first kind of making the transition, and I had a very, just a lack of confidence. I had made a work, which someone pointed out was exactly like Hans Hacke's condensation piece. I was very embarrassed by this, and then stumbled upon Sturtevant's screens, and just really thought, like, who is this, this brat from Stillschule or something who's making such amazing work? And lo and behold, it was this 80-year-old woman. Yeah.
Gianluigi, same question for you in your personal timeline. When do these career formats enter into your consciousness?
Well, Zweig was always present, I think, in teenage years. I think I read the last great story Zweig wrote is called chess novella, when I was 16. While actually Hans Hollein was a very late discovery. The first time I read about it was in a very well documented piece on 032C magazine a couple of years ago. So, as I said, being self-exiled in other disciplines gives you the great privilege of learning and being the last in the room to know something, which is a wonderful feeling. It keeps you beautifully alive. Just as a student, first year, as a freshman. A freshman on cross-disciplinary culture. That's something I want to integrate.
Yeah, just to focus a little bit, and I'll take questions in a minute, so please prepare them. But some of the words that have come up in our previous guests, to if we could learn from these career formats, from these individuals. I think for Martino Camper, he was very interested in this notion of reinvention, of in a sense not being eternally consigned to either the decision that you make at some point in life, and importantly the success that decision may bring you, and that then linked to Sam, who said that both Ziggy Stardust and Johnny Rotten basically pull the plug at the absolute apex of their kind of global domination fame. So there's reinvention and there's a kind of renewal. Irma Boone talked about attitude, a sort of outlook. I guess again in relation to probably all manner of adversities that face you every time you want to do something. And then lastly, Hans Hollein talked about courage. He very beautifully described, he said, I go and see Et El Etnan every year at least, and I leave that meeting feeling more courageous than I did before I went in. So I don't want to kind of force you to crudely simplify, but in terms of the people that you've presented, what might the things be that you learned from that?
I'll say that from what you were talking about, I think what I really appreciate is that, like, the word that I got from there was symbolism. And so it's not, because I would tend to say that, like, a literal adoption of someone else's career format is almost always a recipe for failure. And sort of the symbolism of, like, the suicide career, not career suicide, but the suicide career, and kind of taking a look at that, not in its literal form, but all of the kind of beauty and action and passion around it, which I think is something that is quite, both symbolism and passion is difficult to endure in the climate that I think we're all kind of making work in or doing what we do today.
I wouldn't really love to be more consistent and focused, which was just as an editing of a movie is consistent and focused every time. every moment of a very, very well done, well edited movie. And I'm not speaking of a technically well edited movie, but is something that resonates harmonically with a sort of sense of ending. Pasolini said that the editing of a life, just as an editing of a movie, is something that the ending of a life, just as the editing in a movie, is what set things together. And the way, and thinking about how is life ended, like brutally murdered in an homosexual situation in the outskirts of Rome in 1975, is exactly what happened to his post-death fate, his posthumous fate, as a sort of mythical ending of being crushed, like by the same people he would go out and which is sang in his poems and films, like the proletarian, some proletarian of the Italian, some proletarian of the 50s and 60s, and the queers of that period, like that kind of human landscape that he adored and endorsed. And it's strange that he made, like 1 year before, he made that statement about the ending of a life being to the life itself, like the editing is like the footage for a director. I think that in both Zweig and in Hollein, you see a strange consistency in choices, even with a multitude of choices, a multitude of tools that they have undertaken. Like architecturally speaking, Hollein did many different things in many different scales. At the same time, from glasses to shops, to big urbanist attempts, to museums. At the same time, goes for like Zweig, who did playwrights, journalists, speeches, novels. He was a prolific biographer. He wrote 5 or 6 biographies, like of Berlin, of Erasmus, the Rotterdam. So very different people. Of Marie Antoinette. So very prolific and cross-disciplinary heroes themselves.
Yeah, and I mean, perseverance is the obvious arc over all of this. And then saying that, Sturtevant and Herzog is still making work. He's part of a group of filmmakers who are in their 70s, which I would count Ridley Scott and Jean-Luc Godard, who's in his 80s, Woody Allen to some extent, who are just getting up and doing it, but Herzog more than anyone, Sturtevant, I think, especially more than anyone. I mean, her ability to see things, not just be prescient, right, and say cybernetics is upon us, but to continuously present that and not do it as an overlord who looks down on us and says, I thought of it first, but just to really continue to participate in that world, and Herzog as well. I haven't seen his last film. I don't know what it's going to be like. But I mean, Cave of Forgotten Dreams was not so long ago, which was a film that went into a cave that no one would go into. And this is something that I think I try and remind myself is to not, to just push and kind of step outside of yourself into these situations, and to maybe worry a bit less about that pesky word, career.
I've got one more question. Are there any questions from you guys? We heard towards the end. So I want you to both imagine that you could time travel, and you basically get 5 minutes with the 16-year-old versions of yourself. Do you give yourself any advice? And if so, what would that advice be?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll take the risk. it might seem like a populist answer, or like trying to get a sort of good response from the audience, but actually it would not be an intellectual thing, because I actually, when I was from 16 to 18, I did everything I wanted to do in terms of reading, which is still one of the most deepest and guiltless pleasures of life. So I read probably 2 books per day. I didn't attend a lot of school, but I really read and read and read. At the same time, my life was completely split between going out with the same girls for 2 years, so I did fiancé at 16, which is an horrible thing, and read and read and read. So I would say keep on reading, but give up that girl, because then she left me for my best friend. Cecile?
If we're time traveling, can I travel into the future first and then go back to the past? I think
What do you
I
think?
have to.
Yeah?
Total liquidity. I think it would be really similar. I would just say take care of yourself. And not in this sort of like reckless way that you do as a 16-year-old, but just in terms of focus. And and then to repeat it again with the Herzog quote, read more, but see, and see more, and just to be kinder, and also like, I think this is really important, life format, like especially in fields that we are. I think as a 16-year-old, I didn't really understand the power of super cheesy, like just being yourself. And I'll stop there. But yeah, just
Be yourself.
Yeah, be yourself.
That would be your
Take care
advice.
of yourself. And don't date that guy either.
But this question is really interesting, and I tell you one more anecdote for Zweig life. Because if you would pose this question to Zweig, I'm sure that he would answer with a much more important answer, which is related to the fact that Zweig lived in Vienna for a certain moment in a street, down the street lived a house painter that usually worked like in renovation of houses, so we get better architecture, and he saw him very frequently, like painting things in the neighborhood on a ladder, and the house painter was Adolf Hitler. So he would probably, a young Adolf Hitler, so he would probably knock off the guy from the ladder. And it's obviously laughing thing, but it's something that he would for sure do, because that obviously in a way, and I'm getting back to the desperation that he felt like it was his fault. Not because he didn't knock before, but because this is another symbol. And we are all responsible for not knocking off the ladder someone or something, or maybe some part of ourselves. I'm speaking also about two people.
But the truth is we don't know the symbolism of the ladder until much later.
Yeah.
Right? Until the opportunity to knock it over is probably past. Before we thank our 2 guests, just to let you know, these beautiful posters that Wayne Daly did, there are a bunch of them here at the front. Please help yourself to them. For those of you who come to all of these, I thank you very, very much. I hope it's been worth it. Will you please join me in thanking Cecile and Gianluigi, and thank you all.